As we continue to look at the morphology of American Sign Language, we continue to explore the rich inflectional system that ASL has. In particular, the verbal structure of ASL provides numerous examples. We've already talked about the fact that certain types of verbs take certain types of inflections. Some are plain, some verbs can take inflections related to location, locative verbs. Some are depicting verbs and they change depending on the shape of the object they're representing. Some are agreeing verbs or indicating verbs, they're also called, that show interaction between various people, subjects and objects and so forth. So let's take a look at this a little bit further. First, we know that certain verbs can be inflected to show particular types of meanings. Whatever types of inflections there are, these inflections are bound morphemes that are added to the free morpheme, to the verb. Some of these are movement inflections, some of these are facial expressions. In particular, they're mouth movements that change the meaning of these verbs. When we look at movement inflections, one of the first examples that we see are movement inflections that come with agreeing verbs. These verbs inflect to show subject and object agreement. So with these indicating verbs or agreeing verbs, we have some forms that are fully inflected and some forms that are semi-inflected. Now, a fully inflected verb starts at the subject and goes to the object. So if I say, I give to you, then it starts at me, the subject, the one doing the action, and it goes all the way to the object, the one who the action is being done to. I give to you. You give to me. Could also be he, starting off to the side, he tells me. He tells me, I tell her or him. So in these situations, the verb fully inflects goes from X, whoever the subject is, to Y, whoever the object is. Give, send, look at, these can be fully inflected. They can also be what are called semi-inflected, which means they start in neutral space and then they go to the object. So if I say, the teacher gave me, I may not ever set the teacher up in space, so you may not know where the teacher is, but if I say the teacher gives me, then it's just going to come from neutral space to me, to the object. If I say the teacher gives you, and I haven't set the teacher up in space, then the teacher starts in neutral space, gives you. I won't start it from me to you because I'm not the teacher, or from over there because I maybe haven't chosen to set the teacher up on either side. So it's just semi-inflected. It still moves toward whoever the object is, but it doesn't start at the subject. Another type of movement inflection is the movement inflection to show the duration of time over which something happens. There are several of these. 4 of them we'll talk about right now. The first inflection is the repeatedly inflection. And this inflection involves a sort of zigzag motion in the verb. To study again and again. To look at again and again. That can be contrasted with the continuous motion. The motion that gives the idea of something that happens for a long time without a break. So to stare at. Now that gives the idea that I'm just looking for a long time at one particular thing, whereas repeatedly gives the idea that I look and then maybe I do something else, and then I look and I do something else. Sort of a halfway mixture of those two movement inflections is the over and over inflection. This inflection implies that something is done with a lot of effort and perhaps in a tiring way. So if you say you study over and over again, then that could be so that's almost like the back and forth of repeatedly, and almost like the circular, but instead it combines the two. A final movement inflection that can be added to some verbs is the movement inflection of quickly, and that is signed just as you would expect, to study very briefly, to read something very briefly, or glance at something. The sign itself is formed with a quick motion to show that the idea of the verb is performed in a quick way. Along with these sorts of movement inflections, we see what's called the distributive movement inflection, which certain verbs can take. With the distributive movement inflection, you can modify the verb to show the idea that it interacts with many instances of a particular object or with all instances of that object. So for example, if I talk about a class of students and I say that I give to each one a paper, then it has this that is signed in such a way that shows giving to each, this sort of back and forth zigzag, as opposed to the sweeping arc, which would mean to give to all. The same as I could tell to each student a story, or I could tell to all the story. So the distributive aspect shows either the fact that something is done to each one or that something is done to all as a group. And most verbs that are agreeing verbs can be modified in this way. So you can look at each student or look at all the students. Another interesting inflection that can happen with certain agreeing verbs is the reciprocal inflection. The idea that something is done from the object to the subject and from the subject to the object and from the object to the subject, both directions. So two people can look at one another or understand one another or give to one another. This gives the idea that both the subject and the object are interacting. And it's obviously a much more economical way of saying something than English, which requires this to one another. One sign simply does that in American Sign Language. Now that we've talked about the movement inflections, you can see that there's also a rich adverbal facial inflection system. Now these are called facial inflections, but really they center around the mouth. The eyebrows in ASL tell us about the types of sentences, whether they're questions or WH questions or rhetorical questions or whatnot, whereas the mouth itself is used to modify the meaning of verbs and adjectives. In this case, we have verbs that can be modified. The first example we have is this one. It's labeled TH. And when that is accompanies a verb, it means that the verb was done in a careless or haphazard way. So you could read something in a careless way, or drive in a careless way. Secondly, you have the puffed cheeks, which gives the idea that something is done a lot. Perhaps you work a lot, or you read a lot. The LALA, or sometimes the facial expression, gives the idea that a verb is done for a long distance. So to drive a great distance could be signed this way, or simply with the ah. Sta is a facial expression that can be added to a verb to show that it's done with great difficulty. So if you work really hard all day, then you might sign. Notice that there's also the circular inflection, which shows the idea of continuously. So together with the continuous motion, which means for a long time, and the sta, which means with great difficulty, then that shows that you worked really hard all day. Similarly, the bared teeth with a verb indicates that the verb is done intensely or with a lot of effort. So you could also sign that you worked really hard all day. Or if you were staring at something with a great intensity, you might bare your teeth to show that you looked at something trying to figure it out. Another facial adverb that can be added is the facial adverb, performed this way. That facial adverb means that something is done just in the normal way. You're sort of emphasizing how routine something was. Routinely, normally. Often this is used just before you explain that something unexpected happened. For example, perhaps you were just walking along when suddenly you tripped on something. You might sign that you were walking normally and then you tripped. And then finally, we have the OO, or the OO facial expression, which is used to emphasize that something is done with little effort very easily. If you wrote something very easily, you simply or read it very easily. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of all facial expressions that can be added to verbs, but this will give you some to look for. Just remember, when you're using these, you're not miming. Try to avoid thinking of this as some sort of pantomime. You need to act out what it's like to type in a haphazard way. No, you're not acting out at all. You're using the face to add a meaning. So you don't need to sort of pantomime what you're doing when you use the facial expressions correctly.